So I want to start off by saying we've got good news. And I like to start off talking about good news, the compliment sandwich. Good news, bad news, good news. Did you all see the release yesterday from the March of Dimes about prematurity and that Indiana's prematurity rates are going down? Anyone seen that? The March of Dimes prematurity report? If you haven't, take a look at that. That is tremendous good news. The best news is that black infants born before 37 weeks had the highest decline from 14.1% to 13.2%. So that is just a great accomplishment. It's a testament to the work that you all are doing out in the communities to lower our infant mortality rate. The bad news is that we still only grade out as a C for prematurity as a state compared to the other states, and we still have one of the largest health disparity indexes, meaning the difference between black infant mortality and white infant mortality in our state. So we've still got work to do. And I just turned off the... Okay, so what I'm going to do is just kind of lay things out for you all, set the table so that you can better put into perspective some of the talks you're going to hear later today. And I want to point out initially where the United States sits. And the United States is 26th out of 26 Organization for Economic Development countries, or the developed countries in the world. Our infant mortality rate is 6.1 compared to Japan, 2.3, Finland, 2.3. We're basically behind everybody. So the United States is not doing anywhere near what you would expect in terms of infant mortality, and we spend more money by far on health care than anyone else in the world. So we're bad as a country. Indiana is number 7 out of all of our states, 7th worst in terms of infant mortality, and we've been there for a long time. The blue is Indiana, the teal is the United States, and what I want you to notice from this chart is that the United States is not only at or below the Healthy People 2020 goal of 6.0 per 1,000 live births, but they've trended down. So we look at not just spots in time, but trends, and we've been trending down for infant mortality in the US, which means we're doing something right and we're continuing to do it on a national scale. Indiana's numbers have popped up and down, but there is no consistent trend down. So we've got a lot of work here to do in Indiana. Worst developed country, one of the worst states in the developed country. But I really believe you've got to dig deep in data. One of the things that I preach is making sure you look at the data, because what you think you see is not always what you're seeing. So let's look at the regions. Again, Healthy People 2020 goal is 6.0. There is no region in our state that is below 6.0. The worst regions are Midwestern, Eastern, and the Central regions. But let's dig a little bit deeper. The red are the worst infant mortality counties. The green are the best. The green are the counties that have an infant mortality rate below 6.0. The red are the worst. Adams County, up to the right, is 9.9, one of our worst counties. Lake County, St. Joe, Porter, Marion, Montgomery, Henry, Bartholomew, Davies counties all have terrible infant mortality rates. And you notice that some of those aren't in the regions that we pointed out, so we can't just go by region. We've got to look at the county and see what's going on in the county. And digging even a little bit deeper, these are the 10 worst zip codes for infant mortality in our state. And you see Allen County, which didn't show up on this map as a red, actually has a zip code that has the worst infant mortality in our state. Allen, Lake, and Marion dominate this list. And so if we're going to look at interventions to really lower our infant mortality numbers, we've really got to dig down all the way to the zip code, to the block-by-block level, because there are things going on that we're not going to see if we're just looking at the big numbers. Now, some of you have heard me talk about infant mortality before, and one of the things that I say is we're talking about infant mortality in the state of Indiana, but we actually don't have an infant mortality problem in the state of Indiana. What we have is a health disparity problem that we're seeing manifest through the lens of infant mortality. And why do I say that? The red line down the bottom is our white infant mortality rate in Indiana. It's 5.8. We're below the Healthy People 2020 goal of 6.0. We're on par with Oregon, which is the safest place in the country to have a baby. But our black infant mortality rate is 15.3, 3 times our white infant mortality rate. So again, we don't have an infant mortality problem. We have a health disparity problem. And if we don't recognize that, we're not going to move our infant mortality numbers. If you look at Hispanics and non-Hispanics, and a lot of people ask that question, The numbers are unstable because we don't have a lot of Hispanic births in our state. But if you look at Hispanic, 7.3, 8.1, 7.4, 8.6, I'm going backwards. They are still consistently above the Healthy People 2020 goal. They're still not where we want them to be. And we actually expect that once we have enough Hispanic births to get stable numbers, we're going to see that they are consistently above our white infant mortality rates also. Now let's look at infant mortality rates county level by race. The blue are the worst black infant mortality counties, Lake, St. Joe's, Allen, and Marion County. And the whites are our worst infant mortality rate, or the green is our worst infant mortality rate by whites. You will notice that the best black infant mortality county on this list, Lake at 12.8, is still worse than the worst white infant mortality county, Montgomery County, at 10.3 on this list, again showing the health disparities. The 4 blue counties on the list, the black infant mortality deaths account for nearly 80% of all the black infant deaths in Indiana. So if you look at infant mortality rates by race and by zip code, again breaking it down, Lake and Marion and Allen dominate the black infant mortality list. Hendricks, Marion, Porter, LaPorte dominate the white infant mortality list. So if we're going to do an intervention looking at black infant mortality, it may look very different in those Lake, Allen, and Marion counties than what it's going to look if we're looking at a white infant mortality initiative in the other counties. You're going to have to do it in a completely different place. You're going to have to talk in a completely different language. And even in Marion County, zip codes do not cross over. So we have to tailor our interventions to specific zip codes, to specific blocks, to specific cultures, and specific risk factors. So looking at risk factors in my last few minutes here, people say, well, what's causing infant mortality? Well, perinatal risk, 47.6%, the majority of that. That's extremely low birth weight, prematurity, and you have congenital malformations, which are largely genetic causes, and people say they're not preventable. I contend that a lot of them are. People aren't getting enough folic acid because they're not seeing their doctors before they get pregnant. 14.0% sudden unexpected infant death syndrome, that's safe sleep, alone on your back in a crib. Those are 100% preventable. So even though they're only 14% of deaths, I point them out because they're largely preventable if we get the word out about safe sleep. Now, if you look at the breakdown between whites and blacks, you see that blacks have disproportionately higher numbers of perinatal risk deaths. Again, prematurity, low birth weight, and those sorts of things. So what are the factors, the risk factors contributing to infant mortality? Obesity, we're the 9th most obese state. Smoking, we've got the 12th highest rate of smoking and the 7th worst rate of smoking for pregnant women. Limited prenatal care, and unsafe sleep practices. So showing you the breakdown by race, this is obesity. We see that whites and Indiana in general are about at the Healthy People 2020 goal, but blacks are significantly higher. Now this is interesting, and we can talk about this later if you have questions, but actually our black smoking rate is significantly lower than our white smoking rate. Still much higher than we want it to be. We still need to pay attention to smoking, but it would suggest that the disproportionate black deaths in Indiana aren't due to primarily to smoking. Percent of mothers who smoked any time during pregnancy by race, and again, this talk speaks to interventions in different counties. Grant, Vandenberg, Anderson have our highest rates of black smoking. 1 out of 4 black moms smoke in Grant County, whereas Crawford, Scott, and Owen have our highest smoking rate of whites. Up to 1 in 3 women smoking in Crawford, Scott, and Owen County, 1 in 3 moms smoking. So we want to tailor different interventions, again, to different counties and different races. Your Baby and Me Tobacco-Free program is going to look different in Grant County than it's going to look in Crawford County. Percent of mothers who receive prenatal care, and this is a biggie here, because there's studies showing that if you receive 10 prenatal care visits, your infant mortality rate goes down to almost 0. And barely over half of African Americans in Indiana moms are getting prenatal care in the first trimester. No one in Indiana is getting prenatal care in the first trimester to the degree that we would want for our Healthy People 2020 goal. And again, this is just looking at trends. We've been there for a long time. We've been way below the Healthy People 2020 goal, and blacks have been at the bottom of that in terms of getting prenatal care in the first trimester. If you break this down by race, again, prenatal care in the first trimester, St. Joe, Grant, Floyd, Allen, the worst counties for blacks getting prenatal care in their first trimester, whereas it's a completely different set of counties in the white area. So we talk about nurse-family partnership, we talk about healthy families, we talk about interventions to increase prenatal care, and those are going to look different depending on the counties and the races you're talking about. So when we talk about closing the disparity gap, which is what we're here for today, if Indiana brought its black infant mortality rate down to the state's infant mortality rate, because it's not fair to say we're going to bring it down to the Healthy People 2020 goal. Let's just bring it down to the state's infant mortality rate. 82 additional black infants would have lived to see their first birthday. If we brought it down to the white infant mortality rate, 96 additional infants would have lived to see their first birthday. And when you're talking about 600 total babies dying in the United States, we can significantly bring down our infant mortality numbers if we focus on the health disparities. In terms of closing the disparity gap, if the counties with the worst infant mortality rates, the 11 worst counties lowered their combined infant mortality rate to Indiana's rate, 253 babies in those 11 counties would have lived to see their first birthday. So remember again, I told you there are about 600 deaths. We could take care of about half of those if we would focus our efforts on those 11 worst counties. If the 10 zip codes with the worst infant mortality rates would lower the rate to Indiana's, 165 additional babies born in those areas would have survived. So we don't even have to go to 10 counties. If we zero in on those 10 worst zip codes, we can save a third of the babies who are dying in our state. So with that, I want to finish by saying we need to first be aware that disparities exist. And we talk a lot about race, but there's economic disparities. There's urban versus rural, which is one of the worst disparities that we have in our state. There's Hispanic and language disparities. And really what I want you to do is say, what are the disparities in my area? Who is worst affected? How can we use our data to focus in on who's being most affected and tailor our interventions to those people? We must look at statewide data to determine the best goals and interventions for each area, again, even down to the zip code level. And with that, I want to thank you again so much for being here. I hope you stay engaged. I hope you laugh at Carlos's jokes. And I hope that you have lots of good questions for the speakers who are going to come here today, because we need to take the energy from the room today and take it out into our communities, into our counties, into our regions, into our zip codes, so that we can no longer say that we are the 7th worst state for infant mortality. Thank you very much.